So, our topic this evening is going to be liturgies of blessing and curse, actually. We're going to be talking about curses as well as blessings, all sort of two sides of the same coin. We'll be focusing mostly on blessing, obviously, but it'll be interesting to see how liturgies of cursing relate to blessing and help us understand what blessing actually is as well. So, a few observations before we start. We're going to make a distinction between an act of blessing and an act of consecration. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But here obviously is a blessing, and here is a consecration. The first woman bishop in the Episcopal Church, Bishop Harris of Massachusetts, here. We're also going to have a little look at liturgical language of blessing. Are we actually dealing with the imperative, bless this, God, or may God bless this, a subjunctive? God, curse my enemy, or may God curse my enemy, more of a subjunctive feel to it. And that raises the question, does God have to do what we say? And is that what we mean when we're talking about blessing? Or is blessing more about relationship than about power? That's a question I want to keep at the forefront here, because we're going to discover as we go along that blessing, far from being all about power and the exercise of power by the person who is blessing or cursing, or the God who is blessing or cursing, is more to do with God's relationship with us, with creation, than it is to do with the exercise of God's pure power, that we might think of in terms of magical blessing or magical cursing, which is more to do with power and the manipulation of power than it is to do with relationship. So that's an important point to make even before we begin. We're also going to explore what we mean by blessing. Here's a couple of definitions. When we invoke blessing, is it giving a person or an object something that wasn't there before? Are we introducing something, introducing a blessing there? Or is it bringing out something that was there actually all along, some inherent quality of the thing or person that we're talking about, and up till then we just hadn't paid attention to it? What's the difference then between blessing and something that we've come to call mindfulness? So blessing here, here's a couple of definitions: God's favour, God's protection, similar words to it, a protection or favour. The opposite of it is condemnation, and it's a prayer asking for God's favour and protection, according to this very secular website. As you can see, we're going to be defining blessing in a very different way, but here's the way in which it's commonly understood by an average person who may not have done much thinking about it, or may not be involved necessarily in a Christian community. Mindfulness, the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. You can live life in a way that is not mindful at all of the qualities and the beauty around you. But here you can see it's rather different from blessing, because they defined mindfulness as a mental state achieved by focusing your awareness on the present moment. Well, blessing is partly that, while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings and thoughts. Blessing is not necessarily about your feelings, not necessarily either about your thoughts. It's about putting yourself in a relationship with God. Whereas mindfulness and the secular notion of mindfulness, though it shares some things in common with what we mean about blessing, it does stand in distinction to what a Christian might mean about blessing. We're also going to ask another little question. If God created everything and saw that it was good, why do we need to bless our food and our water and our houses or our gardens? or our candles. So what you can see on the screen here is a very interesting little prayer, because it's a blessing, but it's also a plea for mindfulness. Can you see how the two are sandwiched together? God bless this garden. May we see in its beauty the wonder of your love. It's sort of calling to mind something that is already there. So it's a mixture of saying, yes, everything that God has created is good, but we need to invoke God's blessing in some way on this thing at the same time. And it happens in every single one of the bidding prayers of this blessing. It's accompanied by a sort of invocation of seeing something that we might not have seen before. We're also going to ask the question, what is it appropriate to bless? What about that? Is it appropriate to bless guns or tanks or bombs? Is it appropriate to bless, say, our animals? Here we have the Cathedral of St. John the Divine and the blessing of the animals on St. Francis's Day. I'm not sure I'd want to carry a swan anyway. I was always brought up to believe that they could break your leg, so perhaps they do need a blessing, but it doesn't look like the swan is terribly happy about that. Do animals need blessing? Are we blessing them for our own sake and not for theirs? What are we using blessing for in this particular instance? And here's a little prayer for the blessing of your medication. What difference does it make to its efficacy? Does it combine a sort of wonderful placebo effect with the actual scientific and medical blessings that taking your medication brings? Here on the left you have a prayer for the blessing of medication. God, who in a wonderful way created man and still more wondrously renewed him, who were pleased to aid with many healing remedies the various infirmities that beset the human condition, mercifully pour out your holy blessing on this medicine, so that she who takes it may have health in mind and body through Christ our Lord. Amen. And it is sprinkled with holy water. I hope the lid's on when that happens, because I'm not sure it would do any good to medication to sprinkle it with any sort of water, holy or not. Let's look then, first of all, at the difference. Is it ever appropriate to curse somebody or something in God's name? Here you have the excommunication of Robert the Pious. It's a painting by Jean-Paul Laurent. This is an old rite of the Church that was abandoned actually after Vatican II. Essentially what would happen is a group of 12 priests would come together with a bishop with bearing lighted candles and a bell and a book. And a prayer of excommunication would be said, and then the candles would be turned upside down, the bell rung, and the book closed. And here is the prayer of excommunication. Wherefore, in the name of God, the all-powerful, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of the blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, and of all the saints, see how it's got to do with power? In virtue of the power which has been given us of binding and loosing in heaven and earth, we deprive him and all his accomplices and all his abettors of the communion of the body and blood of our Lord. We separate him from the society of all Christians. We exclude him from the bosom of our Holy Mother, the Church in heaven and on earth. We declare him excommunicated and anathematized, and we judge him condemned to eternal fire with Satan and his angels and all the reprobate, so long as he will not burst the fetters of the demon, do penance, and satisfy the Church. We deliver him to Satan to mortify his body, that his soul may be saved on the day of judgment. You can begin to see why maybe Vatican II thought better of this ancient rite of excommunication and eventually set it aside for some other remedies, which are not quite curses, but they sort of flirt with that idea. Sometimes curses have more to do with power than they have to do with blessing. And we need to remember, actually, that Jesus, in fact, cursed the fig tree, but we'll be coming back to that in a little minute. So firstly, a look at blessing and consecration, just so that we get the distinction clear in our mind, so we know what we're not talking about and what we are talking about. If you consecrate something, you're going to set it aside for a very specific purpose, like the consecration of the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. They no longer are just bread and wine. You're not bringing out an inherent quality in them. You are, if you like, using them to express something else, to be something else. If you bless something, you bless it to perform the function for which it was created. So from people to books, and in this case, to candles. The thing that you bless is not standing for something else. It is itself. It's a candle, and it stays a candle. And you've blessed it for a certain purpose, or recognized its inherent blessed qualities for a certain purpose. Whereas when you take the blood, the body and blood of Christ, and in the form of bread and wine, you're saying that they no longer serve the purpose of being bread and wine, even though you're bringing out their inherent qualities. They suddenly come to stand for something else. Does that make sense? Joris, did you want to add something to that? Because I don't think I've explained it very well.
I think it's really, so it's so when it's consecrated, it becomes really something different. Whereas when it's blessed, well, I will talk about that when I talk about blessed bread. I think it's going to
great.
More,
yeah, we can come back.
We'll see a good example of this difference when we talk about blessed bread. Yeah.
Now, this noun benediction, it sounds a bit religious-y, doesn't it? But all it means, it comes from the Latin, bene meaning good or well, and diction meaning to speak. So to speak well of something. Although it's most often used in this sort of religious sense of prayer and blessing, and especially a ceremonial blessing at the end of a service, say, when the priest says the blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, etc. But it can mean any expression of good wishes. You can say to anybody, bless you, or, oh, bless it, or that blessed thing, or something. So it's a good word that is addressed to God on behalf of human beings, or actually to human beings on behalf of God. God can bless us. We can bless God, as Joris talked about in his sermon a couple of weeks ago when he was speaking of the cycle of blessing and putting in our minds that the idea of blessing is something to do with a sort of cyclical relationship. That's why we say, blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So when we bless each other or something, we're praising God as well. It's an act of praise. We're invoking God's presence, and we're receiving this manifestation of God's presence at our side. Blessing infers the fact that there is a power or a presence in the universe that is numinous, and that we're invoking it in a place where perhaps we're not always conscious of it. Blessing wouldn't make sense if this numinous presence that it fills the universe didn't exist. It wouldn't mean the same thing, I don't think. So the blessings that descend on people and things include everyday life, and they include the whole of the liturgical year, as we're about to see. At every stage in people's life, they receive God's blessing. Here we have a priest blessing a baby at a baptism, and here in this picture we have a priest blessing the coffins of the dead during the pandemic. This is a fairly recent photograph. So all the way from birth through death are occasions to receive God's blessing for all sorts of different reasons. We bless ashes in the Christian year. We bless candles in the Christian year on the 2nd of February. That's coming up. So perhaps you want to buy a few candles in the next week or so and bless your candles at home with us here in the church on the 2nd of February. That would be a nice thing for us to do together. Here we're blessing palms on Palm Sunday. Here there's the blessing of the holy oils on Holy Thursday at the Chrism Mass. The holy oils of that are used for confirmation and for healing and for baptism. We bless fire at Easter time, on Easter Eve, the blessing of the new fire. So you can see all the way through the liturgical year there are prayers of blessing, not just on the people at the end of every service, but also on these liturgical moments. Not just liturgical objects that we set aside for a particular purpose, but the blessing of things that God has granted us with that become symbols of different things. So we bless water, we bless candles, we bless fire, we bless branches, we bless all manner of different things. Let's think for a moment about blessings in the Bible. In the ancient world, a blessing, just like a curse, is a powerful act that human beings are able to perform, especially in the Hebrew Scriptures. And this power to bless can be passed on to other people, like from father to son, as we can see in this painting of Jacob blessing the sons of, no, it must be the other way round, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, blessing the sons of Joseph, sorry. So it comes from God, who is often called in the Hebrew Scriptures the Blessed One. And one word sums up these blessings, and that is shalom, peace. It doesn't just mean a feeling of well-being, it means a reconciliation of all creation and all people with the blessed peace of God's reign. So God sometimes gives his blessing to individuals in the Hebrew Scriptures. Sometimes God gives blessing to the people as a whole. In fact, God's first action after creating women and men is to bless them. He blesses them and says, "Go forth and multiply." We'll think about that first blessing in a second because it relates to many other blessings. In Deuteronomy 28, if the people... Oh, here's Jacob wrestling with the angel. Do you remember this story in Genesis? Jacob wrestles with the angel. Jacob gets injured and limps for the rest of his life. But at the end of this wrestling, he says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So this struggle for God's blessing, this struggle to be in relationship with God, to receive that blessing and to be aware of it, is something that the Bible puts forward in really fascinating and interesting stories that connect with each other. Every time you see the word blessing in the Bible, it's worth bringing to mind a couple of other stories where that word occurs, because it can never just be understood in isolation. It's quite a nuanced and quite a complex interweaving of what this relationship means. It's not a static action of power that takes you always to the same place. It moves you in relationship to God and in relationship to other people. In Deuteronomy 28, if people are obedient to God, all sorts of blessings are going to come on them. Crops, livestock. Deuteronomy 28 says that their baskets will be blessed. Their kneading troughs for bread will be blessed. Your barns will be blessed. It's a pretty thorough blessing, this, in Deuteronomy 28. All the work of your hands will be blessed. However, according to Deuteronomy, there are also curses attached here. So here, some helpful soul, Andrew Womack Ministries, of the Prosperity Gospel, has helpfully set out what will happen to us if we're naughty. Blessed coming in and going out, and you will be cursed coming in and going out if you don't do what he believes that you should be up to. You will get financial prosperity if you pray the right way and do the right things, and you will be cursed with poverty. if you don't, as if poverty is always a curse. We'll see that this has very little to do with what the Bible has to say about blessing and awareness of God's presence in things. Everything you own will be blessed, including your multi-million-dollar mansion and your private aeroplane. But your finances will be cursed if you don't do the right thing. You will get victory over your enemies if you do the right thing, but you will be oppressed by your enemies if you don't do the right thing. And Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. So we've got everything in the left-hand column and nothing in the right-hand column if we do the right thing. So you can see here the ambiguity of blessings. When you see things simply for themselves, you are not getting the idea of what blessing is. Blessing is not about something, physical property in itself. Oh, it's a blessing that I have such a wonderful home. Well, it doesn't exist in and for itself. It needs to be understood in terms of relationship and not in terms of a static possession. Moses, here by the burning bush, is blessed by God. The patriarchs are often blessed by God in a special blessing. So here we have God blessing not just the children of the Hebrews, but also individuals in the Bible. As time went on in the Hebrew scriptures, these special blessings became the prerogative of the Levites and the priests. Not just of ordinary people or, the patriarchs who were blessing their children and what have you. And Aaron's blessing here that you can find in Leviticus served as a sort of prototype for this. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. This is still repeated in the blessings at the end of our services in church. And there it is on the right-hand side in Hebrew for us, ending with this word here, shalom. So you can see this evolution in the Hebrew scriptures of an idea of blessing. It starts out with this sort of primitive exchange with mysterious forces that bestow good or evil in the earliest part of the Hebrew scriptures into this sort of expression over time, over the evolution of the Hebrew scriptures, into a sort of spiritual bond that links human beings with God. I've often said that if it wasn't for defeat and humiliation, the Hebrew scriptures would never have been written. They were a product of the defeat, the Babylonian defeat, and how that Babylonian defeat brought people into closer relationship with God, and how they re-understood blessing to be not just victory over their enemies and smashing up everybody who disagreed with them, but entering into a deeper and deeper relationship with God and an understanding of what God's blessing meant and where God's blessing could flow, even in the midst of disaster and crisis. So the children of Israel here are experiencing these benefits from God, and they're responding with praise and thanksgiving, and they're blessing God in their turn, so that there's this sort of reciprocal movement of God's blessing us and our blessing God. Anything to add about the Hebrew scriptures?
No.
There. Now this continues in the New Testament. Here we have an illustration of William Blake, of Jesus blessing the little children. Some of them very little, in fact. You'd hardly believe that he was able to walk, this one, let alone kneel down. There we go, very Blakean. Jesus blesses the little children. Jesus blesses the apostles just before he ascends into heaven. It's his last act on earth is an act of blessing. This is in Luke chapter 24, verse 50. Luke's Gospel opens with the Benedictus of Zechariah that we sometimes recite in morning prayer. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has visited and redeemed his people. It's a great canticle of blessing. Here is Zechariah on the right, and here we are on the left here with John the Baptist, I believe. Jesus blesses the loaves and the fishes before the miracle of the multiplication. Here his hand is raised in blessing over that, together with the hands of others who are raised around and about. At the Last Supper, he broke the bread after pronouncing a blessing, giving thanks to God, and Jesus does the same thing at the little house in Emmaus, where he breaks the bread, and then people recognize him, and he disappears from sight. In Jesus' instructions to his disciples, he says, "Bless those who curse you. Bless those who curse you, and do not curse them." And Jesus promised to those who followed him that if they were faithful to him, they would enter into this ultimate blessing. They'd receive this ultimate blessing of entering into the kingdom of God, even the blessing of the repentant thief from the cross. So Jesus' whole life is filled with this outflow of blessing, his blessing of God, his blessing of others, those who bless him, the women who shout to him, "Blessed be the womb that bore you. Blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord." There are those who bless Jesus too. This great reciprocal nature of blessing is flowing also through the New Testament and not just through the Hebrew Scriptures. Paul takes part in these meals, as we hear in Corinthians and Galatians, in which they share the cup of blessing, just like Jesus did. And in the opening of the letter to the Ephesians, it shows this sort of flow of blessing from God to people and from people to God. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places." I wanted to talk very briefly now about curses too. Cursing exists in the Bible too. You may remember the earliest and most famous account of cursing in the Bible is the expulsion from Eden, and 3 special curses. See if you can remember them. First of all, God curses the serpent. "On your belly shall you go, and dust shall you eat." Remember this? The cursing of the serpent. Then God curses Adam and says, "From now on, you will bring food from the earth with the sweat of your brow." A sort of specific curse. And then Eve is cursed to have pain in childbirth. So we can see God is cursing in the Bible too. Did you want to say something about the sword, this flaming sword at the gate of Eden?
So the Garden of Eden is this place of where everything is good at the beginning. It's a place of basically pure blessing, which, because it is also a place of blessing, has some demands on the people who live in there, and one especially. And so when they trespass this demand, then they're chased out of the garden. And if you remember, at that moment there is the angel that carries the sword, and that's a very strange sword here. Yeah, it's a revolving sword, and the word for sword in Hebrew, when you turn it around, it's the word for blessing. So when you invert the letters, and it's really this sword that is inverting in a certain sense, in both keeping the garden and inverting, keeping separate for a certain moment the good place and the place where they walk on their solitary way, hand in hand, and the whole story of the continuation of that will be the continual engagement with God and the attempt that He will have to give His blessing to the people, but people usually try to cheat or try to find a way around it and not receive it.
That's powerful. Also, I think something that we forget here. On the right-hand side here, you can see some ancient Egyptian execration shards. If you had an enemy, you would write their name in hieratic here. This is a sort of written form of hieroglyphic, a cursive form of hieroglyphic. You would sometimes do it on a human-shaped little piece of something or other, or sometimes you would do it on a piece of pottery. And then you would take it to a sacred place and smash it and read the names on top. Incidentally, it's one of the ways in which we know the names that are in the Bible of cities and sometimes people did actually exist, because they appear on these execration texts. We think, oh, how terribly pagan and horrid. But look at the Bible. Very often we don't say these words in the Psalms. They're missed out of the lectionary. But they seem to be also execration, cursing texts that were recited in the temple in Jerusalem. Here's a very famous example from Psalm 137, I think it is. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundation. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy are those who repay you according to what you have done to us. Happy are those who seize your infants and dash them against the rocks. So this is a sort of imprecation text, a text of a psalm of cursing. So we can see that even in the worship life of the ancient world, in the Psalms, this idea of cursing forms a contrast to the idea of blessing. Seems to be calling on the same spiritual forces that exist in the world to deprive, to withdraw blessing, to make them infertile. Now, has the use of blessings increased in the early church? Oh, here's Jesus cursing the fig tree, for instance. There's a comment you want to make on that too, Joris?
No,
I'm sorry, I'm counting on you for curses here.
Well, it happens just before the crucifixion and before the capture. And I mean, the fig tree is also reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, as you remember. That's the fig tree that clothes Adam and Eve when they realize that they know, and that this big inversion of their innocence happens, and they get to know, and it's all the problem of the Hebrew Bible, of the questions of how do you know, what's knowing, how knowing relates to power and relationship to God. And so the cursing of this tree is quite interesting, because it's killing this tree that has provided some form of habit, like a protection, a clothes to Adam and Eve, whereas when Christ is himself going to be stripped and is going to go on the cross, on the dead tree. So it's a prefiguration, in a certain sense, of the cross and the crucifixion, and showing that even that, I think, is part of God's power.
Mm. Isn't it fascinating that there's the work for curse there, and it, as you can see in the Greek, it's implying that something is going to be deprived, something is going to be stripped away, something is going to be taken out of something. So a curse can never, it's always the reversal of something that is good. It's never the introduction of a new independent power. It's all about deprivation. It's not about addition or a supplement to something. A curse can only be a taking away. And as we'll see when Joris talks about blessed bread, a blessing is always an augmentation or a recognition of the implicit quality of something. So a curse is a taking away of that. It's an impoverishment of something beautiful that God has made. That's what a curse is about. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think when you think of like looking at something, or directing your desire, the curse is mostly like looking away, or not looking, or like not directing your desire in the good direction, which is not always straight, but the good direction. Whereas the curse is not getting involved in this relationship of like recognizing each other with God and yeah, it's also again the question of the relationship that's at play.
Yes.
Like the curse is is moving away from the relationship.
That's isn't that interesting, because that helps you understand what was happening on the cross, and that even in the place where blessing was removed, where blessing itself became a curse, you know, is it possible for God to die? How can God curse God's self? And yet there, in that very moment, it's transformed into a place of blessing, not just for Christ through his obedience, but for all of us.
Yeah.
The power, the curse is broken, and fullness and richness of life flows from the very place of cursing, and enriches us all with everlasting life, and fulfills our potential as the children beloved of God.
Yeah, it really extends the power of blessing to the places where curse was working in a certain way, and so by extending it, especially on the tree, which was the place from which the curse came, it's really completing this and revolving, really turning upside down the curse, which always have something to do with knowledge. That's what I find really interesting, and how knowledge of God, which is the first commandment.
Yes. Let's think for a minute. As the use of blessings increased in the early church, blessings became appropriate not just for the bread and the wine, but suddenly also for the water that was used for baptism, but also for lots of other things too. By the Middle Ages, many Christians believed that nothing is to be used for the glory of God and the service of human beings unless it's first been blessed. So blessings could even become these sorts of rites intended to rescue people and things from the dominion that the demons were regarded as having over the world. So this is why we saw that after a little time, before the water was used for baptism, the water would have to be exorcised, which is what you've got this little app for here. That was an interesting discovery. See, this app contains the traditional Catholic blessing of water, exorcism of salt used in the making of holy water in the Catholic Church. Clearly it didn't take them long, because here they've just opened it at 7:13 and by 7:16 they've got their holy water. So it's worked quite quickly there, and it's not really depleted any energy on their battery either. So you can see that what we've got here is rather a pessimistic view of creation. How dare you think that water that has been created by God is possessed by demons? Can you see what an odd idea this is? That you have to exorcise something before it can be blessed? I mean, we might say that might have to be the case for human beings, but for God's creation, it's rather a squalid way of looking at it, a rather pessimistic vision of creation, that before something can be blessed, it has to be exorcised. Am I making sense? A simple prayer is not going to be enough. To recognize the inherent holy qualities of water, it's got to be accompanied by an exorcism that precedes a blessing prayer. We'll come back to that in a little while. There are very interesting passages in St. Hippolytus' apostolic tradition. This is the early 200s. There's some little controversy about whether the whole thing is his. It might have been added to as years went on. As you can see, he came to rather an unhappy end. He was a martyr, St. Hippolytus here. You can look up his story if you like online, but we won't get into it here. What we want to talk about for a minute are his very practical instructions on what to do what blessings you're going to use when you come together as Christ's people. Milk and honey are going to be blessed for people who are going to be baptized. There's also a little passage in here on blessed bread, isn't there, Joris, in Hippolytus? Perhaps you'll talk about that later on. In the community's evening meal, because you can see it's very early, it's the 200s, it's before the whole thing was formalized into an abstract fragment of a meal. People are still gathering together for this shared Christian meal, and they're blessing more and more things in the middle of this meal. So the bishop is going to say a blessing prayer over the lamp, as if we said a blessing prayer over the candles every time we lit them on the altar. Blessed bread is going to be distributed to the non-baptized. And the fruits of the earth are blessed. There's even a list of fruits and vegetables that it's appropriate to bless, as I've put down here. You can bless grapes and figs and pomegranates, olives, pears, apples, peaches, cherries, almonds, and plums. Now, I'm not sure if this is because all of these fruits are mentioned in the Bible. Sure, I remember. Are there plums? Maybe there are in the Song of Songs. Something must be compared to plums in there. Yeah. But you can't bless pumpkins, melons, cucumbers, or anything that's smelly, like onions or garlic. You may remember that Pythagoras had some fancy ideas about this. Because onions and garlic gave him wind, he decided that they were not good vegetables to eat because they caused the passing of the spirit through wind. It's believed that maybe this was influenced by Ayurvedic Hindu traditions, that anything that grows underground in the dank and dark places is not to be eaten, and anything smelly is not to be eaten or cannot be blessed in that particular way. But who knows? He also talks about flowers, incidentally. He says it's appropriate to bless lilies and roses, but not really any other sort of flower. So, never mind. Now, these blessings that Hippolytus talks about were extended a little bit later to the blessing of fields and crops and livestock in the Middle Ages. Certain things were blessed on certain days. So, for instance, beans were blessed on Ascension Day. You might think, what an odd connection. Well, if you've ever grown beans, you know that they grow really fast and they grow up, 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 up. So,
children's tale. Harry and
Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack. Yes, that they go right up into the clouds where he meets the giant. Yeah. Yes, that Jack the Giant Slayer. So you can see that this odd connection between the blessing of things and certain Christian festivals as the years go by. The blessing of lambs at Easter time, or just before Easter. The blessing of we read a couple more of them over the last summer, didn't we? So. Related to certain points in the agricultural cycle. Now, one of the things that we're beginning to understand about the act of blessing is, do you remember at the very beginning, God's first act after the creation of human beings was to bless them and said, go forth and multiply, for a variety of reasons. Blessing is all about the fecundity and richness of God's creation. It's all about achieving maximum fruitfulness, revealing this sort of miraculously creative nature of people, the wonderful potentiality that lies in things. And that's why it's often associated with praise. Praise for this abundance that we all carry within ourselves, whether we're aware of it or not. And when we invoke God's blessing on people or on things, we're calling on them to bring out the best that God has made us all to be. And we're recognizing that fact and celebrating it. God's celebrating that in us, and we're giving thanks to God for making us so creative and full of that sort of fecund potentiality of the richness of all creation. Go forth and multiply doesn't just mean go and have babies, though very often people have read it that way in the Bible, probably written there because of the decimation of the Israelite people, the Judite people after the Babylonian exile. But really what you read in that, according to the rabbinic sources, is this place, go forth and multiply, meaning be creative yourself. Bring out this great blessing that God has put upon you, and make the earth rich with the blessing of God, and allow all things, live in harmony with all things, so that they too may be blessed and bless.
Yeah, we'll see later when we talk about blessed bread, but blessed bread also comes with multiplication of bread, and this idea of like extension, like really expansion and yeah, asymptotic almost, endless.
Yes.
Fruitfulness of God.
I rather like that idea, something that I've sort of learned as I've been preparing it a bit. So who is allowed to bless? Allowed in inverted commas here, because we've already said that blessing is less to do with power and more to do with relationship. Allowing people to bless sounds like blessing is more to do with power than relationship. So let's just use that word for 1 minute. I think it depends on what it is that's being blessed. So there's a vast difference between blessing a liturgical thing that is used by a whole diocese or a whole community, and the blessing of an evening meal in the home, for instance. There's a vast difference between the priest of a parish blessing the people at the end of a service and a mother or father blessing their child before bedtime. Do you see? Who would say the father or the mother is not allowed to bless their child? Do you see? It's about relationship, about reciprocity, about bringing out the best and bringing peace, shalom, comfort to each other. So blessing, I think, it can be carried out by any member of the people of God in accordance with the nature of the blessing in question. So here we have the blessing of a newly constructed altar in a cathedral. It's appropriate that the bishop bless this. It's appropriate that the bishop use the holy water and wander around the table to do this job. Oh, he looks very much like my friend Nicholas Wheeler on the right-hand side. Almost identical. You'd say it was his doppelganger, although he's not Catholic, and clearly this picture is. Or at least I think it is. It's this cotter that's given it away, maybe. So that you can see that there's an appropriate person for a blessing, but blessings can be carried out by all God's people in different circumstances. Consecration might be a different matter, but blessing, certainly. We can sit round our table and bless our evening meal. You can ask for God's blessing on your home, on your family, on a candle, on something that you might use in your own home. So that raises the question of what blessing actually does. What happens when we call down God's blessing? Does it put something, a power, a resonance, into a person or an object that wasn't there before? Is it introducing something? Or does a blessing point to something that's always been there, but we haven't seen it? Do you see the difference between those two things? Take water, for example. Is holy water chemically different from ordinary water? What happens to it when we invoke God's blessing over it? Does our conscious use of that water after blessing that water show us something sacred about a thing that God has made? Without water we would die. There's something holy about our relationship with water, though we're not always aware of it. I leave it running sometimes if I'm brushing my teeth. I wander off. I waste it. I'm not always aware of its holiness, of its sacredness. And yet when somebody says, "Can you bless this water for me?" and I take it up to the altar and I invite them to come and accompany me and pray with me as I bless the water, I'm suddenly aware of the blessing of water throughout my life in all sorts of different circumstances and places, and it suddenly becomes focused right there on the altar, on that vial of water that I'm blessing. And here there's a great deal of it. Some of it in enamel buckets, some of it in a pink old bucket that somebody has brought along. This is ordinary water, but suddenly we're aware of its sacredness. It's caused us to relate to God's creation in a different way. It's pointed to something that was there and we didn't know. Like Jacob's pillow. Surely God was in this place and I never know it. It's the very place that is a ladder between earth and heaven. Blessing brings out the sacredness of something. It doesn't introduce sacredness into some object that is entirely Corban. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the consciousness part is important, but it's also not limited to a certain cerebral consciousness of it, you see? Like the use of them, and they remain blessed even if you're not thinking about them, you see? So it's a form of... I think we can compare it a little bit to the incarnation itself. It's kind of like doing two objects, what the incarnation is, what the incarnation of Christ is to human beings. So it's really what it is. It's really a human, but at the same time, it's also recognizing the power of God working through these objects. Or creatures, because they're usually called creatures in traditional blessings, water.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So there's no strict distinction between inanimate and animate, which is a Greek distinction very much, whereas you have this form of continuity between the two. And in the blessing of water, in the traditional books of prayers, of bread, we'll see it later, it's called creatures.
I love the way that you've invoked the incarnation in that. The incarnation is possible because of the sacredness of being itself.
Yeah.
Let's think a minute about the blessing of liturgical vessels. Here you've got them all set up in front of you. Chalice, paten, purificator, corporal, ciborum, folded chalice, veil, pawls and burses, aspergillums and thuribles and pyxes and monstrances and cruets and what have you. All of these liturgical bits and bobs that are set aside for a specific purpose. Now, we've done this in the church. We bless crosses, we bless books, we bless the tabs that we use to put in the Bible. I think we did that a little while ago. We're going to bless candles. One of the things that people believe that they're doing when they do this is withdrawing this object from use in the profane world. That is to say, you're not going to take the paten and put a McDonald's burger on it because you can't find a plate. It has been recognized by the people and by the priest as an object that is no longer in profane use. The cruets, the chalice, you're not going to have a nice glass of beer from it or something. It has been set aside for a particular purpose. And we use the formula of blessing for that. So it's no longer a cup. It's no longer a plate. We have invoked God's blessing on it for a specific purpose. You can bless your crocs if you want. You can bless your china. You can bless your glasses at home, giving thanks for the food that you eat and everything else. But you're not setting them aside for a specific liturgical purpose, imbuing them with a ritual significance, setting them aside for God's use. Now that's an important distinction, but here's the danger. Sometimes the object is going to become more significant or more important than the action that this object is supposed to be helping you to perform. So you see these things, these objects, as holy in themselves, rather than seeing them as vehicles of the holy. Yeah. This is an important distinction, say, in Hinduism or in ancient pagan religions. Sometimes the objects were worshipped for themselves, rather than being a vehicle for the blessing of God to come through them. So this fine line between setting something aside as an idol and setting something aside as an object that has been blessed, is the vehicle of God's blessing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think what we tend to forget, because usually in traditional worship, these objects are beautiful ones. It's also why they feel set aside, is that they are sacrificed object.
Yes.
In the sense that when you decide to use this cup for only that purpose, you're removing it from the daily use. So you sacrifice the object in a certain sense in its use. And all of these objects that we use for the liturgy are sacrificed objects. They're not object fulfilling all their worldly use. They're really set aside, not because they're more holy than the rest, but because they have given some of what they could have done, especially for that purpose.
What a beautiful point. We made that the other day, didn't we, when we talked about flowers, that they're a sacrifice too. They're cut, and anything that approaches the altar has to speak of sacrifice. And just as you say, these objects, the table can no longer be used as a table. It is a table for one specific purpose. It's no longer a table. It's given up its tableness.
Exactly.
For something else.
I felt that if you have like a little altar, a little place at home, something like this, that may happen to you. It happened to me once when I had someone over who put their cup on my little altar, and I felt like, well, that's not really a table anymore. You can put the glass next to it, but not on there, because this is sacrificed. That's what makes it special, is that you're actually behaving towards it in a different way.
I remember when I first arrived at Saint-Esprit, I had this little call from Woody Allen, who wanted to use the church as a sort of holding place for his film Mighty Aphrodite, which is about the Episcopalian Dame de Petite Vertu. And they were filming round the corner in Gino's restaurant, and I came downstairs in the middle of all of this to see what was going on. And there was a lady, an extra, I think she was, who was up on our altar where she'd spread all of her makeup out on our altar and was looking in the stained glass window to see if she could see what was happening. And I said, "What on earth are you doing? This is our altar." And she turned around and she said, "There is no mirror in this establishment." And I said, "Precisely, there's no mirror in this establishment. Take your makeup off our altar." And I think I never realised why I was so offended. It was sort of a visceral thing, but that you've just explained exactly why. It's using it for something that it was not set aside. It was compromising its sacrificial status.
Yeah, because it was normally set aside. I mean, it was meant to be a table. It was meant to whole thing, but it's not that you set aside it as something that's different, like an altar. An altar is a sacrifice table. Yes,
yeah, and that's why I was so upset. I suppose.
Its identity is having something less, not having something more.
Very interesting.
Oh.
Here we go with Andy Dici, and we're setting aside these little clay figures, or well, they're not clay, are they? They're plastic. I mean, it's a very humble-looking thing, but it makes the point. Yeah. These are not dolls or playthings in that sense. Oh, I know we bless them every year. My glasses could have done with blessing that particular year. and my hair too. Never mind. So that you can see that when you set objects aside for a particular purpose, whatever that purpose might be, you're drawing attention to them in a very specific way. And anything that you do with them or to them, once you've done that, is going to detract from why you've performed this act in the first place.
That's really interesting, Nigel, because it reminds me also of maybe the difficulty we've had with the internet to actually bless it, or like engage, like difficulty we have to set it apart for worship, because it's actually doing something that is doing usually. You see, it's not sacrificing much when it's doing its job, like through the liturgy, when we film the thing. It's a sacrifice for us, but the object itself is not really sacrificed. It's technique. It's doing what it's supposed to do.
Yes, and it would be hard to imagine a specific camera, a specific internet connection, a specific screen that could only ever be used for liturgical purposes, and what that would actually do, and what sort of a discipline that would entail. It's an interesting idea. It's worth looking into, maybe.
Yeah.
Let's think about the blessing of food for 1 second. These obviously are kolivan. This is a special service that we have with using bits
ours.
and symbols. These are not ours. I'm not sure I'd put chocolate bars on the top, but it sort of worked actually. Or hundreds and thousands here. I'm sure that see that you put on the top of a trifle. But that's rather sweet. Perhaps a child made it. But I'm not sure that Dominique would approve. There are different sorts of blessings for food, even. And here is a liturgical sort of food that has been set aside for a specific purpose. It's hovering between many different worlds. It's a sacrificial food that is used in the liturgy, that is consumed in memory of somebody whom we have lost. And yet it also nourishes us. It's rather different, perhaps, from the blessing of food that you might do around a table. And the question here, it might sound frivolous, if a priest blesses food, does it taste better than when a lay person blesses food? And the obvious answer is don't be absurd. Of course it doesn't. It might be more prestigious as a fancy meal to have a priest there say grace, like I have to do at certain weddings and what have you. But really, the whole point here, as Joyce is going to explain in a minute, is that we're calling to mind God's bountiful provision and the sacredness of what it is that we're about to consume. And a layperson can do that equally as well as a priest can. In fact, I've known some lay people say much, much better graces around food than priests very often do. The priest might come up with a ready-made little something or other that they always say, whereas a layperson may be able to conjure up a moment of sharing, know something about the food that the priest doesn't know, where it came from, who made it, what it cost them to buy something special for that particular meal, and to be able to weave that into a prayer of thanksgiving and blessing and fruitfulness, or know something about the people that are gathered around the table that the priest may not know, and be able to pray in certain ways with that make that moment a very holy and blessed one. So it's not all about inspiration and family life. The blessing can be done by anybody. Did you want to add to anything to that, or will it come up again in a minute?
No, I just wonder when you will make your own cookbook, Nigel.
Yeah, that's right. I certainly wouldn't be cooking in... Mind you, I have been cooking in a clerical collar more recently. Not a happy thing to do. And I'm a lot messier. Look at all of those lovely
Yes.
little bowls and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey-ho. How about the blessing of buildings? Here we have Bishop Shin somewhere. Oh, here he is, there. You can see with the mitre, with JB behind there. I think I'm here on this side. Is that Makiko here? There's Bettina, I can see, and various other people gathered around. Here's Catherine. That looks like Stephen at the back there. There's thingy. This is the blessing of the building next door but one that we did at the beginning of 2017. What happens when you bless a building? It certainly doesn't attract new lucrative tenants very rapidly, I can say, since we've not managed to rent it out at the speed that we wished. But when we recognize that this is a gift from God, that it came to us through very, very careful decisions, very prayerful decisions, we can see all of a sudden here in this picture that we're gathering together to bring out the potential of that building, to recognize it as something that God has given us, and a place there of blessing, of exchange, of the deepening of a relationship. Anything to add there, Joyce?
Yeah, I think it's also linked to this idea of sacrifice once again. Like it's a building that's going to be, well, like it's going to be rented, it's going to be used, so there may be some, like there's money taken from the rents and everything, and how it's going to be used is going to be used for the service of the church. So it's setting it apart too in this sense.
Yes,
it's
that's
not
true.
We're not just going to use the, I mean, it's a we first, so it's not a private property in this sense, and it's really going to set it for a special use, a use that may not be what other circumstances would do on this building.
Yes, that's a good way of thinking about it, isn't it? It is a we, and it's setting it aside for that specific use.
I mean, I wonder, like all blessings are something to do with we, in a sense.
Yes.
Like you never bless something for your own sake.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's always relational.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Let's think about some more controversial use of blessings and where they are more to do with power and the exercise of power. What do we think exactly is going on here? The blessing of weapons is, we might think, oh, it's a very recent thing. This is quite a departure, and it's to do with modernism and what have you. Here we can see the blessing of, I don't know what they're called, precision something or others. But down there on the right, we have the blessing of swords, and the blessing of swords that were going to be used in the Crusades, for instance, to cause the streets of Jerusalem to be knee-deep in the blood of the Saracens and the Jews. So the blessing of weapons of war has been a long practice in the Church. Also, I was looking through this, the ritual of coronation of kings, for instance, or the blessing of our presidents by the invocation prayers today that we heard. What are we doing when we call down God's blessing on secular rulers? What does it mean? We hope perhaps that it's a prayer that God will assist them in making good and proper decisions, but we also know full well, if we read the news, that however good our president might be, they're going to make some decisions that are actually quite detrimental. They're not going to abolish nuclear weapons. They're not going to make really consistently sensible decisions about the exploitation of the earth. We need to think about that quite carefully, I think. Perhaps it was more sharply set in relief, say, if you watch the Queen's coronation and all the religious paraphernalia and regalia about that. And yet, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the Queen is obliged to give speeches to Parliament where she's cutting social security, where she's deciding not to give food relief. What are we doing when we're using the power of the Church to bless things, people, that perhaps we're well aware are not going to be achieving their full, fruitful potential?
Yeah, there's something interesting with that, because we call on blessings, for instance, on the United States, and I'm sure they did it today, but we don't really hold the nation accountable, so it can exercise its power, its imperium, it's still have Guantanamo and all of these things, and still you would call the blessing as something positive, but doesn't always imply a sacrifice that comes with it to set it apart. Just the whole story of the nation of Israel is the struggle with that, and how they try, like how God sets them apart and has a certain, expect a certain relationship with them in response, and not just not just to call on bounty and prosperity on the nation. There's something ascetic to blessing too, as we saw with the setting aside of certain things and certain persons and certain goods to serve. Yeah.
And I think certainly if blessing is about relationship, it must come hand in glove with accountability. What you are willing to bless, you must also be willing to call out if the blessing is not bringing forth the fruit that you prayed for it to bring forth. Because if blessing is about anything, it's about relationship, and therefore about accountability. It's interesting, if you look back at the history of blessing in the Church, it's not always been rosy. For instance, during the Inquisition, red-hot iron was blessed before it was used to torture people into confessions. The boiling water that was used for the same purposes was blessed. So was the freezing cold water that was used for trials by ordeal, where people were put through a great deal of suffering for manipulative and horrible purposes. There are also rather odd blessings that still exist, actually. The proliferation of blessings in the Church, in the Roman Catholic Church and elsewhere, continues. There are 600 prayers of blessing, I think, for various different objects and things, including this rather curious object, which is the chastity belt of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was supposed to have received this at the hand of an angel. They're still manufactured now, and they come with a special blessing if you're interested. I'm sure that you can procure them online. So you can see that the whole business of blessing comes with a variety of windows into the different ways in which we relate to God and the ways that God relates to us. And I think if we've done anything up to this point to dissociate blessing in our minds from the concept of pure power, or introducing something foreign into a neutral object, we will have gone a long way to mending a Christian's relationship with with nature, essentially. That in nature, that in God's world, nothing is neutral. Everything was created good. And when we invoke blessing, the blessing that is the exchange between us and God, nature and God, everything around us and God, when we bless in that sort of way, we're restoring our relationship with God and with the world. And it's a pity that blessings have been abused by the Church in the past and used for other purposes of power and control, and setting certain things aside at the expense of others, and losing track of the interrelatedness of all things. That's all I've got, but Joris has prepared something rather wonderful for us on blessed bread. So we're going to swap seats so that he can come over into this spot and I into this spot.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thank
so
you.
I'm just going to continue on. Yeah, there's a question?
You good?
No. Okay. I'm going to continue on what Nigel has explained and showed us with blessed bread, and talking about this very ancient Christian practice, something that has been practiced as old as we can remember, because as Nigel mentioned in passing, Christian meals happened before it was reduced into the little host that we have today. And so food and setting food for this special occasion was commonly practiced. And so it meant that this food was blessed, and part of it was especially consecrated or used to commemorate the sacrifice of Christ. And if you were with us a couple of years ago, I think last 2 years ago, we talked a little bit about early Christian meals and how it was not always understood in this very sacrificial way, but it might have been a form of thanksgiving on the example of Hellenistic meals that were very common and that all social groups would have and gather together for this special occasion. So in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, the church gathered around these meals. So there were full meals. They usually happened on Sunday evening. And it was really common. It's called a symposium, symposia, plural. So it's a form of ceremonial meal that would be involving some blessed food. Even if you were a polytheist, like a pagan, you would have some form of blessing at the beginning of the meal, some sacrificing of part of the meal. You would pour some wine, do some libations, or drop some food on the floor for the gods. And so you see, like, it's always, blessing is always associated with sacrificing a part of what you bless, or certain uses of what you're blessing. So the question followed the practice of that time, and here you can see it's from a catacomb. So there are mostly women, I think, gathered around a table. Probably we cannot really see what they're eating, but they would have, as we see in the New Testament, there are a lot of accounts of meals, and so usually the food that's set for the meal is fish. We've seen a lot of this, and the bread too, and so it's something you could was usually used, a form of blessing for this special meals. So many stories talk about that in the Hebrew Bible, blessing of food, but also in the New Testament. So some narratives really became more prominent in the telling of this story of blessed food and blessed meals. And one of them, Nigel has already told us a little bit about, is the feeding of the 5,000. There are different accounts of it. Here I gave it from, I think it's from John, this one. So it's one passage from the New Testament that has been used. I don't know if we put it. No, okay. That was used a lot to back up the idea of blessing bread and blessing meals. So when, I can read it. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So you see all this question of the bountiful of God, the bountiness that's being present here, and the setting apart, the blessing is paradoxically, because you're setting things apart, you're removing some usages, some way you engage with these objects, it's actually revealing something else. It's actually expanding the experience of a certain object that you may otherwise not realize. You see, it's something quite powerful in the relationship it creates with objects and with people when there's a blessing involved. So here is a painting or an icon of the feeding of the 5,000. So as time went on, the blessing of full meals was replaced by the blessing of bread, which was the staple food also of the Mediterranean and most of Europe. So bread stood somehow for all daily food, and that's also such a part of the Lord's Prayer. Give us today our daily bread. So the presence of the blessing of bread and the special relationship we have with God through bread is not only limited to the very sacrificial relationship we have through the Eucharist. You see, we don't say like give us your body in the Lord's Prayer. You see, so it goes through food itself, and that's why you see also like the omnipresence of eating, and not only in the Hebrew Bible but in the New Testament too. It's really one way people relate to each other through dietary laws, but also to God and to creation as a whole. So when we talk about blessed bread after the beginning of the medieval period, it can refer actually to two realities. I don't know if I have another picture for that. Well, let's skip on this one. So it can refer to two realities that Nigel have already mentioned a little bit. So the bread that anyone or a priest blesses at home or outside or anywhere outside of the sanctuary and the liturgy. And the other one, naturally, is the bread which is traditionally part of the offering of the people and blessed during the Mass. So at that time, and since the beginning of the Church, people would bring sometimes gifts in nature. So they would bring food, they would bring separate things, not always money. Actually, the wide use of money as an offering is quite a late invention in the history of Christianity. But people would bring a lot of things, and one of the role of the deacons would be to receive it and set apart what's going to be given for food directly to the poor or to the people in need, and what would be used for the service. If there were bread, if there was other things that would be needed, like oil or things like this, that would be used and taken from what the people are actually offering. So maybe that's some part of the liturgy that we may want to reclaim a little bit, this dynamic and this exchange that's happening in the liturgy. So the blessed bread I'm going to talk about is therefore different from the private blessed bread. We're not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the communal, the liturgical blessed bread, and it's also different, as we will see, from consecrated bread, that is the bread of the Eucharist itself. So let's have a look at what's the difference in practice, in law almost. So in the East, liturgical blessed bread has been called antidoron or eulogia. Antidoron, it means gift back or giving, so it's come from a verb that means to give back. And eulogia, it means Eucharist, basically grace. So the antidoron and eulogia is very much a part of the Greek, Slavic, and all form of Orthodox worship until today. And if you've been to Orthodox churches, you've probably experienced it. It's really an important part of the liturgy. It's considered like part of this flowing of the bounty of God from the Eucharist is possible through blessed bread, and also part of the reception of the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is taken from that bread. So you see, it's really an important step to the Eucharist and from the Eucharist. So before the service, that's what you see here on the picture. Before the service starts, something is called the Prosco Media happens, which consists in cutting off the bread around what is called the lamb, which is the central part of the bread, of the loaf. Here you see the central part with the cross, which is going to be used for the Eucharist itself. So it varies from Orthodox churches to Orthodox churches. So like from traditions, I mean like Slavic and Greek and Otiokin, they have different rites and they do it a bit differently. But there's basically this idea that's very interesting, that you have one loaf of bread at the origin and you cut it into pieces around the lamb, which is going to be consecrated, which is going to become really the body of our Lord. But the different pieces around are made from the same dough, you see? So there is this shared goodness that's present in the background. I mean, not in background, in the reality of what it is. And these other pieces are going to be set apart in different rites. So for the Theotokos, for the living, for the dead, and be eaten reverentially associated with these different saints or the Virgin Mary. And so they really does this whole cosmos basically around the Eucharist, as if the Eucharist were the sun and you have all the stars around, which are the different particles, because they're called particles. They're little bits, particles. So you see, it's really a physical relationship with the Eucharist that blessed bread has. In the East, especially. So they made with the actually same dough, and they made with the same reverential approach. So here I can show you another picture. Here you can see there is some particles and blessed bread that has been set apart here, and the people are gathered together. You see that it's not the Eucharist. The Eucharist is happening on the altar. So the tradition also exists in the Western Church. It's very old tradition. It was especially present and alive in France until the mid-20th century. Still today, some churches do it, but it's less common. It was usually something that would be done in certain regions every Sunday. And so it was a big, or for very special Sundays, but it was something that every family would do Sunday after Sunday, and there would be a whole culture revolving around this practice of and this devotion and liturgy of blessed bread. So it's part of the liturgy. It's a form of very liturgical blessing. And so one of the first mention of it is from the Council of Nantes, which was probably in 658, and that's in the West. Then it's actually in Brittany. And it's one of the first mention of the practice of blessed bread. So you see, we usually associate it today with the East, but it was widespread until very recently. Here you see, here you see actually a picture that's depicting the blessed bread, le pain béni, in the middle of the 19th century in the east of France. And actually they recreated the scene in the same church. You see, it's exactly the same pillar behind a couple of years ago, I think. And they found actually a little girl that looks exactly like the one in the back. That's quite interesting. Yeah. But what I find quite touching in the old picture is that you see that the woman is looking at the Eucharist, really, or what is happening out there, you see? You see in her look and everybody is looking at what the priest is doing. So there's this deep connection, this triangle, I would say, between she's touching the blessed bread, but at the same time she's listening to what the priest is saying close to the altar, Whereas on the other one, you see that they're here for the picture. So they're all looking at the bread in the basket with the boy. That's a lovely blessing. That's one of the old sacramentaries. That is a collection of rites used for the blessings in the church. The Gregorian sacramentary, it's a redux, reduction too, of a longer blessing that you can find in the Council of Nantes. And that's, I think, quite lovely, and that can actually be used by anybody. It's used by the priest in the Roman Rite to bless the bread in the pain béni, so the blessed liturgical bread, but it can be used in any occasion if you want to use it. So bless, Lord, this creature of bread, as you have blessed the 5 breads in the desert, so that all who shall taste of it shall receive health both in the body and the soul. You who live with God the Father in unity. So, yep. So the liturgical blessing of bread is not something, as Nigel said, that's adding to the bread. You see, when in the Roman Rite, actually, when they do the bread like you see on this picture, they would sometimes use the patina and touch the blessed bread, because of course in the Roman Rite you have a Roman or like Western Rite, you usually have the Eucharist, which is a wafer, so that's not the same dough, you see. But there's still a way, an importance of like having a physical connection with the blessed bread.
So they would touch the. Was it before or after the consecration that they would touch the bread with the host?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have to check.
That's interesting, isn't it?
But it's definitely touched with the.
With the host.
Yes, with the host, or the discourse,
or the pattern.
The pattern.
Yeah.
There is still this physical connection that's really important. That's really showing this like flow of the incarnation of God throughout creation, and that's what blessed bread is doing for the faithful and for everybody. So it's not something added to the bread. It's not something supernatural that's added on the bread, blessing. If we think of it this way, we assume that creation itself is not good as it was created. If we think that it needs a supernatural second power on top of it, as if like the first God of first creation was not the good one, you see. So it's leading to some form of heresies. But the liturgical blessing of bread is deeply related to the sacrifice of the Mass itself. You see, like this physical connection. So it is, in a sense, the food that's the staple food, so the food you would use as the base of all the rest of food, and it's the closestly related to the Eucharist. Yet, it is still real food. It's not consecrated food, you see. So it's really set between two realities, a form of sacred food, the body of Christ, and the daily food you would have at your meals. So it's creating kind of a ladder between the two, up and down from the Eucharist. You see, it's really helping the bounties to flow up and down. In a sense, we could say that also what the blessed bread has been doing in all these communities has been to symbolize, in certain sense, the body of Christ. It's not really the body of Christ, but it's a form of a symbol of it, because people can participate in it, even if they cannot participate in the Eucharist itself. That is, if you are not Greek Orthodox, or Orthodox of any sort, and you attend a Greek service or Orthodox service, you may be able, you're actually usually invited to participate in the blessed bread and have some blessed bread yourself. So it's a way to participate, and people also feel that they're not in a situation to receive it. They may actually take blessed bread and not take the Eucharist. So you see, it's creating something in between, which is really clear. It's not the consecrated bread, it's not the body and blood of Christ, but it is embodying the presence and the life of the community as one body. So it can be received by anybody, as I said, and even by animals. It's not sure. Like there are people who have different opinions about that. As you can imagine, usually the text you find from the church says no, but actually in practice there are many, many good examples and very old ones of blessed bread being given to animals for certain feasts and feasts of certain saints, which have usually stories of their life vitae related to animals and taking care of animals. Here it's for the Saint-Hubert, so Saint Hubert, I don't know, Saint Hubert, in Belgium at the Abbaye de Vaucelles, the Abbey of Vaucelles, I think it's a Benedictine abbey. And there has been this very old tradition in the north of France. There are a couple of villages that have this tradition at the Saint-Hubert to have blessed bread and bread which is given to animals. So in the past it would be given to cattle, and it would be a good omen and a good food for the animals to bless them throughout the year, to keep them and protect them. Here you see the Bénédiction des pains, the blessing of bread in a church in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, in the Flanders, in the Flandre Française. Here you see, it's quite a touching picture. Quite busy. So it actually gathers all the tradition of blessed bread also in the past has had the purpose to gather the community around this practice. So there are actually different bakers who may be involved in the same thing. Yes. So blessed bread symbolizes for sure the unity of the congregation, as I mentioned, because everybody can share in blessed bread, even if for some reason you don't feel you can partake in the Eucharist, or you're not allowed yet because, for instance, in the Roman Rite, whenever you've not done your first communion, you cannot take the communion yet. But the blessing of bread is really like the closest to the Eucharist itself. And it flows from its certain sense from the Eucharist and restore the whole of creation from that point. And it's really deeply related to environmental questions in a very Christian and integrated way. So it's not like adding some environment on top of the liturgy, but it's showing the deep relationship between the inside of the sanctuary and the outside of it, you see? Because you can carry your blessed bread outside. So here it's a picture of people in France, I think. They look really French. And you see, like, I like these pictures because the blessed bread is set on the steps of the church, and that's what blessed bread is doing. Like many other liturgical objects which are blessed to be taken outside into people's homes, it's blessed to be move people outside of the borders of the church itself. So it can be, of course, it could be, of course, involved in some form of outreach or mission. This tradition is really present in different places in Europe. Here in Napoli, in Naples, the Pane Benedetto di Sant'Antonio. So blessed bread is usually associated also with certain saints. And it was given actually for certain saints, just as we saw in the East, where you also set apart certain particles for a certain saint. But what is, I think, really interesting in what it is doing in the liturgy is that it is preserving, in a certain sense, the tension between the daily food and the sacred food that we, as secularized eaters, we tend to forget. We tend to forget that all the food we eat is a sacrifice in a certain sense, because it's been the work of people, it's been set aside for use to feed our bodies, to really do something that deserves a little bit of attention, and that if it's not cerebral attention, it's at least attention in how we deal with it, how we touch it, how we buy it, to who we give it, and how we keep it. So it's related to a lot of different questions which are deeply environmental when we have a look at blessed bread and blessed food, and especially blessed bread. So the Bible and the liturgy always understands one with the other. They are not two separate realities, this sacred realm, if you want, which is the one set apart for the space of the liturgy, for instance, and the rest of the world, the whole creation, unto which the bounties of God are flowing from Christ. So we have a lot of rhythms in the church that have to do with blessing of food and blessed food. The feasting and the fasting of the liturgical calendar is really embodying it, and this has to do with how we engage with liturgical blessed food too. So we tend to forget in a certain way that nothing is deprived of the goodness of God. And I think the desacralization of food that understands it as pure fuel, this very modern scientific understanding of food in a very nutritional way, that's understanding in a very materialistic way that you can see a lot in industrial and Protestant countries, has really had a terrible consequence that we all know. And here is a good example of it. You see all the waste that's being done. So things are being sacrificed, but it's not building anything. You see, that's the big difference with the liturgy. When we sacrifice the use of certain objects, is that we're setting them apart to be directed in a spiritual bounty, you see. Here it's pure waste. It's dust and to dust. Here is a good reminder too. Food waste most prevalent in affluent countries. So you see, the relationship we have with food has deeply something to do with vulnerability and how you understand the depth of what having food means, of what the sacrifice is involved with food. When it has not been filtered through money, you see, which has not been reduced to simply thinking, oh, am I going to spend too much or too less, you see? Or, oh, am I going to fit my diet, my nutritional diet, you see? When it's understood in a very organic and I would say sacred way, food is not dealt with lightly. So blessed bread, interestingly, was thought to have miraculous powers. And many lives of saints, saints of Saint, the saint of Paris, what's her name?
Saint
Geneviève, and was actually portrayed baking bread and bringing bread to and blessed bread. So there are a lot of life of saints that deal with bread making and blessed food and eulogias. So bread, especially when it was blessed by a priest, was considered to have this power to heal people. But I'd like to go deeper a bit, because we may think, oh, okay, healing, well, that's some form of magics, have to do with blessed bread. Okay, it's a bit like heretics, I'm not so sure about it. But I think what is core to the healing power of blessed bread might not be so much a magical charging, like giving some magical power to blessed bread, which can lead to some form of supernatural understanding of it. But it may have something to do with how we use it. So how the use of a blessed creature in the case of bread that we understand to be a creature because it's created by God, is actually deeply related to our social, ecological, sanitary, and health problems. And there is this beautiful quote here from the 18th century priest, who I think really summarizes the point I want to make. Whatever blesses doesn't perform a miracle in that act. Whoever blesses doesn't perform a miracle in that act. But the use of blessed things does produce miracles. That is, if you just recognize that something is blessed, or if you bless it, it's not the action that's creating the sacredness and creating the healing. It is how you use it. And I think we can see kind of the the contrary of it in how we've related to our environment, because we have considered that things are not blessed. And in two ways. We have considered either that we have to impose a supernatural blessing over it, to use it, you see, or we consider just that they're neutral and that they don't need any blessing, so we can use them as at our will, you see. So blessing sets things in a certain order. They recognize that they've been ordered to serve a certain purpose, which is the will of God in its all multifaceted expressions. And so when we actually recognize this, it can lead to some form of healing. Whereas when we treat it as pure material that can be disposed by us, we are leading to ecological crisis, to destruction of ecosystems, to a lot of different other consequences that in the end, or even from the beginning, impact our health, impact our life in communities, impact all of this that we've seen as diseases today, or problems that are in our societies and lives. So our desacralization of all the creation around us has had a direct consequence in the terrible ecological crisis in which we are, that literally makes us sick. So in conclusion, I would just like to remind you the Greek name of the blessed bread I just mentioned, which is antidoron. It means a gift in return, as I said, because it is given by the lay people and received back with the blessing, and when it has been closely associated with the Eucharist. But it also means antidote. And many blessed objects or creatures, blessed creatures, because are they inanimated, are they not? As the prayer says, are antidotes, because they're deriving their power from Christ. They help us in a certain way, as the author I mentioned says, to apply Christ in our environment. So they're really doing this work, you see. They're helping us, a bit like angels, if you want to watch the other videos we've made about angels. They're helping us. And we've come across this reality when we were doing the liturgy. Also, you remember, Nigel, when we talked about the power of objects and how certain objects would actually help you perform a more smooth liturgy. You remember? Because the liturgy set, I guess, like what's the name? The patena we have, and the
chalice, and
the chalice, the paten, and all of this was not meant for the type of liturgy we have. So we have a different set, which is just the patena, but otherwise we have the one with the little foot on it. Do you remember? That can be put on top.
The Huguenot one.
The all Huguenot one. So the all Huguenot one, the patena cannot go on top of the chalice. And so it happened that, what I can say, our sacristan forgot to put the, I think it was the bread and the patena, because the patena was not going as usual as we used to on top of the chalice. So you see how when the objects are doing what they're supposed to do, but they're not really woven into the liturgy, they can mislead us, they can not help us. But when they're actually performing what they're sacrificed for performing, they're actually helping us in this redemption of the world. So it's something I think really important to bear in mind, and not only in mind, I think bear in also all our gestures, is that the creation around us helps us in our coming to Christ. It's not a hindrance, as we have been trained into thinking with our modern and technical thinking, but it's guiding us if we let it be what it is, that is this goodness that God has given us. I think that's all that I have for us today. That's a paved way to the sacrifice of bread. Yes, I think that's all what I had. Do you have something else
That's
to add?
wonderful. Thank you, Joris. I think I love the way that you have described blessed bread as this intermediary between the food we eat at home and say a blessing over and the Eucharist that serves to sacralize all of our lives and relate them to the liturgy, and seeing all of creation as facilitating our return, and our participation in divine life, and how something so the staff of life, the fundamental matter, this bread that we rely on as a symbol for life itself, has been taken on by Christ himself, and has become not just a symbol for us, but also deeply woven into our spiritual lives and our physical lives and our community lives, as a way that sort of leads us back to a sacred relationship with all of creation in terms of its blessing that flows from God and flows back to God. I think that's a good way of looking at this wider question of blessing. And I'm really glad that you were able to bring that for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Well, if you have any comments, any questions, or you'd like further information on something, just leave a comment down below, and we'll monitor it and reply in the comments. Thanks. Well, shall I conclude with a little prayer? Let us pray. Dieu éternel et tout-puissant, c'est toi qui as fait l'univers et son ordre merveilleux, les atomes, les mondes et les galaxies et la complexité infinie des êtres vivants. Accorde-nous de mieux te connaître en sondant les mystères de ta création, et ainsi de mieux accomplir notre rôle dans ton dessein éternel. Nous te le demandons au nom de Jésus-Christ, notre Seigneur. Amen.